Have you ever heard of the movie Clueless? Well, I have a fun fact for you. You know how girls, and now honestly a lot of guys, say the word like all the time? Well, that started because this movie, Clueless, was released. The word like didn't really happen in pop culture like it does now, like, you know, like all the time, like always, you know? But so many girls watched that movie that it became popular to like use the word like in like every like sentence that you like say. All because of the movie Clueless. What we focus on, we will ingest. And whatever we ingest will eventually come out of us. And this isn't a problem until it is. Saying like a lot isn't a huge deal. Adopting phrases that your friends say all the time just because they say them isn't necessarily going to be the end of the world. Some people might get annoyed from time to time, but whatever, it's no big deal. But much like the last few weeks of our series, the potential problem comes into play when we dig below the surface of what it is we're saying and get down to the why of why we're saying it. There's probably nothing deeply broken about adopting the newest phrases or slang words most of the time. Sometimes you just like the way something rolls off the tongue, so you adopt it. I just want to posit that it's at least possible that sometimes the words that you choose to use are revealing something deeper about your heart than you ever thought possible. We have said this entire series that words are powerful, words matter, and this week we're going to punctuate that argument. If there was anyone in ancient Israel who understood the power of words, it was King David. David was a king who was a warrior, but he was also a songwriter. David learned very early on that words were powerful. And the words that he wrote down have been preserved for thousands of years and have affected billions of lives. Psalm 19 is a song that King David wrote about God in his law. In the first 13 verses of this psalm, David reflects on God's laws and eventually reaches a point where thinking about God so much forces him to reflect on himself. If this is who God is, who am I in relation to him? And that leads us to verse 14. May these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight. In Hebrew poetry, which is what David wrote this psalm in, if you put two similar phrases together with one or two different words, it was an intentional choice to show their similarities and their differences. David puts words and meditations together on purpose, the focus of his heart determining the words that come out of his mouth. There's a man named Clint Bruce who was a football star at the U.S. Naval Academy. He was an NFL player and he was a U.S. Navy SEAL. Today, he travels the world and teaches men how to follow Jesus as good men. And Clint has this phrase that he uses all the time in his teaching that he says he takes from the Navy SEALs. And this is what it is. You will never rise to the occasion. You will always sink to the level of your training. It can be tempting to believe that we can live our lives focused on whatever we want and neglect our Bibles, conversation with God in prayer and his people in church. And then in a moment where we're required to rise to the occasion and act like Jesus would want us to, we will be able to muster up the courage to do it. But that's often not what happens. Most of the time, we sink to the level of our training. We crumble under the pressure, and the words that come out, if any, are not glorifying to God. They're exactly what we've been training ourselves to do. Be selfish. Clint and David are telling us the same thing. Whatever we focus on, David uses the word meditate, while Clint uses the word train, but it's the same idea. Whatever we focus on will come out eventually. It's not a matter of if, but when. But there's more to focus on in Psalm 19:14. The way that David ends this statement about his thoughts, his words, and ultimately his heart should tell us a lot about how to unlock better control over our speech. Let's read verse 14 all the way through, because we only read part of it a second ago. May these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. At the very core of what motivated David to use his speech in a way that honored God was the way that he saw God. David saw God as his rock. In other words, David's heart was moved toward God because he recognized and valued God's steady, anchoring presence in his life. If you know the story of David, you know that his life took some wild twists and turns, and through it all, God was present. He was steady, and he was faithful to David. God was an anchor point for David. When it felt like nothing else in David's life was reliable, God was David's rock. And because David recognized and focused on that, he intentionally turned his thoughts, his words, and his heart toward God. David also saw God as his redeemer. If you're unfamiliar with the term redeem, it's a fancy word that means to save, to transform, or especially to win back or to buy back. David was a good dude, and he's considered a hero figure in our faith as Christians, but David was far from perfect. and he made some decisions in his life that were truly, truly despicable. But God did not give up on David. He saved David from his sin. He transformed him into a new person. He won him back from the dark side, if you will. God was David's redeemer. And because David recognized that and focused on that, he intentionally turned his thoughts, words, and his heart toward God. David's poem here sums up our series super well. Whatever we focus on, aka whatever we worship, will fill us. And what will fill us will come out. David focused on who God was to him. And we see the results here in Psalm 19. And just in case you're tempted to think that this was just one good moment in David's life, it's worth mentioning that God, throughout David's life, referred to David as a man after my own heart. Whatever we focus on will fill us, and what fills us will come out. So what do you focus on? I'm not saying it has to be God 100% of the time. That would be awesome, but it's unrealistic. We're not capable of that. But David seems to have spent enough time focused on God alone and his relationship with God especially to know God very specifically and to know who God was to him. So let me ask you, who is God to you? If you don't have any significant answers to that question, like answers that are specific to you, your story, and the way that God has affected your life, then you're going to have a hard time getting to a place where the words of your mouth and the meditations of your heart are pleasing in God's sight. Whatever we focus on will fill us, and what fills us will come out. So I bet you've got strong opinions and feelings and attachments to all kinds of influences in your life. And I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of influences in your life that altered the way that you speak because they've found a home in your heart. I'm not saying that's bad necessarily. I'm just saying that what comes out is usually a direct result of what we've put in, what we've put our focus on. So if you want to become someone whose words are more honoring to the God that you say you've given your life to, it's probably worth your time to put a little bit more focus on who that God has been to you over the course of your life, because this is the point. Words are worship. What flows out of us is a reflection of what we've put our focus on, what we've worshiped. So the words that we speak are a showcase to others and to ourselves of what or who we worship. If you have already trusted Jesus, believe the gospel, and have been following him for a little bit, your next step is to meditate on God's words. Spend time focusing on him and what he's said. Let his words affect your life, and like the rudder from week 1 in the ship, set you on a course toward life and blessing because of his wisdom. If you haven't trusted Jesus yet, you can study his word all you want, and you'll get nuggets of wisdom and life all throughout them. But without the Holy Spirit in your heart, you will never fundamentally change. It's still selfish motivation until he saves you. His words are all about one big story: that God's good creation, his people, fell hard into death and sin because we were too weak to choose life and trust him. So he sent his son to die in our place and to open the door back to trusting him and his words again so we could find life in them. It's called the gospel, the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And the invitation is for that big story to intersect with your smaller story so you can experience God personally.